Hey folks. So another thing that people like to use as a argument against antinatalism is that people enjoy their lives. So therefore, you know, it's okay to create new lives because most people enjoy the lives that they're living. And while it is certainly true that you will a lot of times encounter people who say that they are glad to have been born, there are also other factors to that have to be addressed. And I see a lot of antinatalists touch on this already on YouTube. So I'm just going to add my little spin to it. Um, the fact that people can say that they enjoy their lives isn't a good argument against the antinatalist proposition because, number one, they haven't lived out their entire life yet. And I think that this is something that's really overlooked. When people say that they enjoy their lives, what they really mean is they find it bearable up to that point. Okay, they enjoy it up to that point. They haven't lived throughout the entire experience to genuinely say whether or not that they've enjoyed it. Because at any moment, they can have some serious thing happen to them where they lose their health, they lose their mental health, they lose um, a loved one, and it has some kind of traumatic effect on them, or any kind of tragedy that can happen with life. They haven't gotten to that point yet. They haven't lived it out to the point where they're on their deathbed to answer whether or not their life was justified. But taking taking them at their word that they do enjoy life, it doesn't exclude the fact that on the opposite side of that spectrum, you have people who were born whose lives are absolutely miserable. People whose lives are full of torment from the time that they were children to the time that they reach their adulthood. And what it comes down to, in my opinion, is a balance, is a trying to weigh the balance of it. Because on one side of the scale, you have people who are seemingly happy. They're glibly enjoying life, their lives, or so they say, and they are having a good time, yada yada yada. And on the opposite side of that scale, you have these people who are in immense pain, who are struggling every single day, who are in tears, who are broken down, who are being genuinely abused and tormented by the fact that they are alive. And I would argue that one single happy person is not worth imposing the torment of another. It's just not worth it because the value there is outweighed. Pleasure is something that's not in the slightest bit as potent as pain. You could have, for example, an orgasm and that lasts maybe a few seconds, maybe a minute, who knows? But on the opposite side of that, somebody could be in the most intense pain they've ever experienced. And that pain is not only going to be there at that moment that they feel it, but the trauma, the mental trauma and agony from that pain is going to be there maybe days, months, years after that initial physical or mental pain has already left them. So they're still going to have that residue of pain that agonizes them and traumatizes them. So really it comes down to this. Are you going to impose the risk of a person enjoying a cookie at the expense of somebody else possibly going through the worst kind of torment that they'll ever experience? And do you think it's justified to have someone tortured like that just so someone can enjoy a cookie that after they eat it, it'll be gone and they'll have to soon find another cookie to satisfy that craving? Because really happiness, or what we call happiness really in modern day, is just a chase after hormones and chase after feel-good methods to avoid the otherwise boring and painful backdrop of what life is naturally. It's a never-ending addiction of trying to find ways to cope with life. But on the opposite side of that, pain, suffering, agony, these things come naturally. They come freely. You don't have to work for it. They come to you. And when they do, you never know at what capacity. So you have somebody who can endure pain and be okay with it, but at the same time, you have someone else who endures it and is not okay, but they can't do anything about it. Why? Because life entails pain. It entails suffering naturally. So that person might go through intense physical, mental pain all their lives and never have a way to get away from it. So when you factor in this, it's a risk averse problem. The risk is too high. The risk of creating an unhappy life is too high. It's too high because people don't value the general measure that suffering can produce in a life. They don't value that. They don't think about how high suffering can go. Suffering doesn't have a limit. And that's another thing people don't factor. There is no limit to the suffering you can feel and endure with life. There is no limit. Unlike happiness, where you reach a threshold and you can't break through it. There are only so many times you can do a certain amount of things and you can't do it anymore. As much as you might like to eat a good food, you cannot keep eating that good food endlessly without feeling full or making yourself sick or not wanting it anymore. And at the same time, pain and suffering can compile and pile and pile and pile up and just keep piling indefinitely until a person dies or just lives in an absolute wretched existence where there is nothing but pain and sorrow and misery every single day. And to me, that is far greater of an aspect to pay attention to than the happy, glib facade of happiness that people put on when they have their pleasurable moments. Because like I said, those pleasurable moments are nothing in comparison to pain and suffering. They're nothing. They don't nearly weigh as much. Hedonism is not as strong as pain is. And most of the time, hedonists know this. They know that at some point, pain and suffering is going to come around that corner and it's going to take all that pleasure away from them, and they're going to be left with pain. And so you can't justify creating a new life to possibly go through that just because people say they enjoy their cookie. Oh, they enjoy their ice cream. They enjoy their video games. They enjoy their sport. They enjoy sex. They enjoy the temporal things that give them that momentary rush and then it leaves. But on the opposite side of that, again, you could possibly create a life who not only suffers, but suffers endlessly until they die. So there is really, in my mind, no comparison to which one would be better. It is infinitely better to not create anyone, so long as that risk is in place. The fact that cancer, the fact that degenerative diseases and suffering exist in this world should be enough by itself to any reasonable mind to not want to impose that kind of potential onto a child, onto their newborn. To me, it makes the most perfect sense that that wouldn't be a risk that you're willing to impose. Because number one, you're not going to be the one to pay the price for that. The child is. You might enjoy your life, but what's to say that your child won't? And this is what gets me when people see these kids and things who end up committing suicide or who just end up being extremely depressed, and parents always act so surprised. What did you expect to happen? You didn't think that was a possibility? And most of the time they don't think it's a possibility because they've been fed this lie in society that your kid's going to be just fine, just like everybody else. And so they really don't think about the long-term consequences of life. And the most shitty aspect about that, speaking of suicide, is that once you create a life that is so horrendously tortured, there is no way out for that person. They have to deal with it. Because number one, you're not given the option to opt out. You can't have euthanasia because virtually every country on this planet bans euthanasia in the most real sense of that word. So if you create a life, if you create a child who not only grows up to hate and resent life, they don't have a way out painlessly that they can take. They have to endure it because you thought they would be happy for it, and they weren't. Is that really a risk that you are sincerely able to impose and are okay with? And if it is a risk that you're okay with imposing, you're a fucking piece of shit and I hate you. That extends to a good amount of people on this planet, actually. If you can look at this shit and say that it's worth the risk just because they might enjoy that cookie that's going to leave and they'll have to chase that sensation over and over again, but on the opposite side of that, the pain and suffering is still going to be there and potent, even far greater than the pleasure. You are a piece of shit and I fucking hate your existence. I hate your fucking guts. Because it's people like you who keep this shit going. You're going to create more corpses for the grave. You're going to create more cancer patients. You're going to create more HIV patients. You're going to create more suicides, more depressed people, more suffering and agony. If you were just to sit there and enjoy your own life, that's fine. That's great. By all means, do you. But the problem is you're dragging somebody else into it on the false premise that's not guaranteed. Whereas death and suffering is guaranteed with life in differing measures, but it's guaranteed. So really think about that. Just because you might think that your child is going to be happy, there is no guarantee for that. And suffering and pain are always more potent than any temporal pleasure that you constantly have to chase after to get another fix of it. That's a prime example is with heroin addicts. You know, when they get high the first time, that initial high fades and they have to keep constantly chasing after it. And like every other thing, it produces suffering because now you had to chase after it and now it's destroying your life. So really think about these things. Really factor in the fact that you have no control over how much pain and suffering life can do to you or your child. And really ask yourself if this is worth imposing. I will argue that it's not. And if you think otherwise, fuck you.